In 1943, as the war machines clashed across continents and empires trembled under the weight of steel and fire, the factories of Detroit roared to life. Their rhythm was relentless, pistons, cranes, hammers, and conveyor belts forming a symphony of production unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. What began as a nation of cars, roads, and suburban dreams was transforming into something far greater, the arsenal of democracy. But to understand the scale of what was happening, one must travel back to the beginning, to the years when Germany's dominance seemed absolute and its war machine invincible. In 1939, the German Wehrmacht had redefined the very idea of warfare. The world watched in disbelief as columns of tanks, the panzers, cut through Europe like lightning. Poland collapsed in weeks. France, once thought impenetrable, fell in mere 40 days. The Blitzkrieg was not just a tactic, it was a revelation. German troops, supported by precision airstrikes from the Luftwaffe, moved with coordination and speed that seemed almost superhuman. The secret was not only in the courage of its soldiers, but in the philosophy that guided them. Auftragstaktik, the doctrine of mission command. It gave officers the freedom to think, to adapt, to act. And at the heart of these armored spearheads were the machines that symbolized German might, the Panzer III, the Panzer IV, and eventually the steel behemoth that would become legend, the Tiger. When the Tiger I rolled onto the battlefield in 1942, it seemed unstoppable. With its thick 120mm frontal armor and its devastating 88mm gun, it could destroy a Sherman or T-34 from well over a kilometer away. Its silhouette alone was enough to freeze the blood of Allied tank crews. One Tiger could dominate an entire battlefield, and yet, hidden within its perfection, was the seed of its own destruction. Each Tiger was not just a tank, it was a masterpiece of engineering, built almost by hand. It required thousands of man-hours, precision machining, and scarce materials. Factories like Henschel in Kassel became the temples of this industrial religion, producing tanks that were beautiful, lethal, and catastrophically inefficient. To build a single Tiger, it took nearly 2 weeks of round-the-clock labor. Each unit consumed resources that could have built multiple lighter tanks or aircraft. By the end of 1944, Germany had produced just over 1,300 of them. Magnificent weapons, but pitifully few. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another kind of miracle was taking shape. Where Germany worshipped precision, America worshipped scale. And nowhere was that contrast more profound than in Detroit, the city that had once been the symbol of the automobile age, of Model Ts, chrome, and roaring engines, became a war machine in itself. In less than a year, its factories were retooled. Civilian cars vanished from assembly lines. In their place came tanks, jeeps, aircraft engines, and artillery. Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal tank plant was the embodiment of this transformation. Built from the ground up, it became the largest tank-producing facility on Earth. The same minds that had perfected the moving assembly line for cars now applied it to armored steel. Here, the M4 Sherman tank was born. The Sherman was not elegant, nor was it exceptional in any single metric. It was, by German standards, mediocre, its gun weaker, its armor thinner, its design simpler. But that simplicity was its genius. The Sherman could be built fast, maintained easily, and shipped anywhere in the world. At its peak, the Detroit Arsenal produced nearly 30 tanks a day, a number so vast it defied comprehension. Factories in Chicago, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh joined the effort, while Ford and General Motors mass-produced engines, transmissions, and components by the millions. For every Tiger that rolled off a German line, 30 Shermans rolled out of Americas. For every German engineer perfecting a new gun sight, hundreds of American workers were tightening bolts on an endless line of tanks. And beyond Detroit, the United States' entire industrial web pulsed with energy. Shipyards in California, aircraft plants in Texas, munitions factories in Ohio, all synchronized into one enormous organism of war. This was not innovation by genius. It was innovation by momentum. While the Germans sought the perfect tank, America pursued the perfect system, one that could absorb loss, adapt rapidly, and sustain infinite production. It was a philosophy born not from military tradition, but from industrial logic. Back in Germany, this logic was absent. The Nazi economy, despite its militarization, remained fractured. Rivalries between industrial giants, Krupp, Daimler-Benz, Porsche, led to chaos in design and procurement. Even as Albert Speer, the armaments minister, tried to centralize production, Hitler's obsession with Wunderwaffen, miracle weapons, diverted resources into hopeless projects. The Me-262 jet, the V-2 rocket, the King Tiger, each revolutionary, each catastrophic for logistics. The result was a production system that created wonders, but in quantities too small to matter. And while these marvels rolled off the lines in trickles, Allied bombers were turning the industrial heart of Germany into ashes. The Ruhr Valley, the beating heart of German manufacturing, became a moonscape of craters and twisted steel. American B-17s by day, British Lancasters by night, the bombers came in endless waves. Their targets were precise: ball-bearing factories, synthetic oil plants, refineries, and rail lines. Each strike cut deeper into Germany's ability to fight. For every tank produced, another was stranded for lack of fuel. For every aircraft assembled, another waited for engines that would never arrive. And as oil reserves dwindled, even the mighty Tiger was reduced to a monument, immobile, hungry for fuel that no longer existed. Meanwhile, across the seas, American ships, Liberty and Victory vessels, formed a living bridge of steel across the Atlantic. Each week, convoys carried thousands of tons of supplies, tanks, trucks, and munitions to Britain, North Africa, and the Pacific. For the Allies, war was not fought by heroes alone. It was fought by factories, ports, and logistics officers. The front line began not at the battlefield, but at the production line. By 1944, the industrial gap had become an abyss. America produced 90 million tons of steel annually. Germany barely 20. It wasn't just tanks, it was everything: trucks, planes, guns, food, fuel. The war had become a contest of endurance, and Germany was running out of breath. By the dawn of 1944, the outcome of the war was no longer decided on the battlefield. It was decided on the assembly line. The soldiers who marched across Europe and the Pacific were merely the final expression of something much larger: the silent war of industry. In America, the hum of production had become the heartbeat of the nation. The automotive giants of Detroit no longer competed for market share. They competed for victory. Ford's Willow Run plant alone was producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Each of its vast assembly halls could fit the Empire State Building sideways. At its peak, 42,000 workers labored in 3 continuous shifts, 7 days a week. Women, the Rosie the Riveters, made up nearly half the workforce. Housewives, teachers, and farmhands became welders, riveters, and machinists. It wasn't just a mobilization of machinery. It was a mobilization of humanity. The United States had become a single living organism, fed by oil, steel, and determination. Across the Atlantic, Germany was being strangled by its own brilliance. Albert Speer, the technocrat who had taken control of the Reich's armaments ministry, worked miracles to keep the machine alive. He streamlined production, eliminated redundant designs, and pushed for rationalization across industries. And for a time, it worked. Despite relentless bombing, German output of tanks, aircraft, and artillery actually peaked in 1944. Factories were moved underground, deep into mountains, mines, and tunnels. Entire assembly lines were buried beneath layers of rock and concrete. But it was a hollow victory. Every increase in output came at the cost of human lives. Tens of thousands of slave laborers from occupied territories, working to death in the cold dark of underground factories. They built the tools of a regime that had enslaved them: V-2 rockets, Tiger tanks, and Messerschmitt jets, as Allied bombs shook the earth above. The Reich was consuming itself, and while Speer's factories worked in darkness, the Allies built in sunlight. In the United States, industrial growth was not only massive, it was efficient. Rail networks moved raw materials with mathematical precision. Oil refineries in Texas and Oklahoma poured millions of barrels of fuel into pipelines stretching toward the East Coast, where convoys waited to cross the Atlantic. The difference between the two systems could not have been starker. Germany's war machine relied on coal, synthetic fuels, and rail transport constantly under attack. The Allies ran on petroleum, highways, and the open sea, vast, flexible, and redundant. Even in the Soviet Union, far to the east, another miracle was unfolding. When the Germans invaded in 1941, the Soviets evacuated more than 1,500 factories beyond the Ural Mountains. Entire plants, machinery, blueprints, engineers, and families were dismantled and shipped eastward by rail. In a matter of months, they were rebuilt in Siberian snow. The result was staggering. By 1943, Soviet production of tanks and artillery exceeded Germany's by a wide margin. The T-34, rugged, reliable, and easy to build, rolled off lines in tens of thousands. For every Tiger on the battlefield, there were 10 T-34s waiting to surround it. It was the same story in the air. While Germany struggled to produce a few thousand aircraft a year, the Allies were churning out tens of thousands. American factories produced over 100,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. From fighters to bombers, from transports to reconnaissance planes. Each one was not just a machine, but a piece of the vast logistics puzzle, the supply chain that reached from the factories of Kansas to the skies over Berlin. By mid-1944, that sky was filled with contrails. Thousands of Allied bombers, escorted by P-51 Mustangs with long-range drop tanks, roamed deep into Germany. No city, no factory, no rail hub was safe. The bombing campaigns were relentless, strategic, and precise. Synthetic oil plants in Leuna, Politz, and Bolin destroyed. Ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt devastated. Rail marshalling yards in Munich, Cologne, and Berlin turned to rubble. Without oil, without transport, without bearings, the German war machine began to suffocate. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, could no longer defend its homeland. Pilots were inexperienced, fuel was scarce, and aircraft often went unflown for lack of parts. Even Hitler's so-called wonder weapons, the jet-powered Me-262 and the V-2 rockets, arrived too late, too few, and too fuel-starved to change the tide. The Me-262 was revolutionary, capable of speeds that Allied fighters could barely touch. But in typical Nazi fashion, Its production was crippled by politics. Hitler demanded it be converted into a bomber, delaying deployment by months. When it finally reached combat units, Germany lacked the trained pilots and aviation fuel to sustain operations. The V-2 rocket, a technological marvel, could strike London in silence from the edge of space. But each rocket cost as much as a fighter plane and carried a fraction of the destructive power. It was terror, not strategy. The Allies, meanwhile, had turned war into an equation. Each loss was calculated, each replacement already underway. If a bomber was shot down over Bremen, another would take its place within days. If a tank was destroyed in Normandy, another was already on the ship across the channel. It was war by mathematics, and mathematics never sleeps. By the beginning of 1945, the Reich was collapsing, not just militarily, but economically, industrially, and spiritually. In the West, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. In the East, the Red Army was advancing through Poland, rolling toward Berlin with unstoppable momentum. Germany's cities were unrecognizable, vast fields of rubble, broken cathedrals of industry. Where once assembly lines hummed, now only silence and dust remained. Fuel reserves had evaporated. Tanks were abandoned for lack of gasoline. Trucks stood rusting on roadsides. Even horses, once replaced by engines, returned to the German army as desperate logistics tools. Factories that once produced tanks now produced nothing. Their workers were gone, killed, captured, or starving. Speer himself would later describe it as a ghost economy, where production figures existed on paper, but nothing real left the factories. The once feared Tiger tanks sat camouflaged in forests, unable to move. Panther tanks, marvels of design, broke down for lack of spare parts. Even ammunition was rationed. In some divisions, soldiers were ordered to hold fire unless certain of a hit. This was not the war of 1939 or 1940. This was the death of an empire built on perfection, consumed by its own complexity. Meanwhile, the Allies moved forward with terrifying simplicity. A single American infantry division had more trucks, fuel, and artillery support than entire German corps. Their advance was steady, methodical, not through brilliance, but through overwhelming capacity. Behind every American soldier stood the power of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, the factories that never slept. Behind every Soviet soldier stood the steel mills of Magnitogorsk and the tank plants of Chelyabinsk. Together, they had forged a new kind of warfare, one where victory belonged not to the most ingenious, but to the most industrial. In April 1945, as the Red Army closed in on Berlin, Albert Speer made one last desperate visit to the Führer's bunker. Hitler, surrounded by maps that no longer mattered, issued a final command to destroy Germany's remaining infrastructure so nothing would fall into enemy hands. Speer refused. He saw what the war had become, a wasteland of factories, cities, and souls. For all his complicity, even he understood that nothing was left to save. Days later, the Third Reich collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. When the guns finally fell silent, the numbers told the story. The United States had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and over 2 million trucks. Germany had produced barely a fraction of that. Exquisite machines, but far too few. The lesson was eternal. Perfection is meaningless without quantity. Genius is useless without endurance. Detroit had not just built tanks, it had built time. Every Sherman that rolled off the line bought another day, another mile, another chance for victory. And so, as the factories of Detroit returned to peace and the last tigers rusted in the ruins of Europe, a new world was born, one forged not by kings or conquerors, but by workers and welders, by the hands of those who never saw the battlefield, yet shaped its outcome. The war of machines had ended, but the legacy of that industrial duel would echo for generations. It was not just a war fought by soldiers, but by the men and women who built the engines of victory, one bolt, one rivet, one dream at a time. If you found this story as powerful as we did, if you believe that history isn't just about battles, but about the people who powered them, then stay with us, because the next story will take you deeper into the heart of the conflict, into the secrets, the sabotage, and the silent heroes history almost forgot. Subscribe, stay connected, and remember, every story of war is, at its heart, a story of humanity.